The Beyond the Binary project puts LGBTIAQ+ stories told by LGBTIAQ+ people at the heart of the museum, from its public galleries to its digital databases and events. We celebrate the strength and agency of the queer community and support individuals and groups in challenging societal binaries around gender, sexuality, and power dynamics. We have set out to disrupt social injustices, starting with the Pitt Rivers Museum, and explore new ways to represent lived experiences. Beyond the Binary contests any notion that queer lives are a Western invention, a new trend, or that queer people do not have history. These events are funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund and Torch, the Oxford Research Centre and the Humanities.
Kia ora koutou, ngā mihi aroha kia koutou. So wherever you are joining from around the world, lovely to have you here with us. I am based here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and I'm Māori, so the Indigenous people here, my iwi, my nations, whānau ākai, Ngāti Oneone, Te Aitanga Maha ki Rongo Whakata, and Ngai Tāmanuhiri. I'm chair of Te Whanawhana Trust, a trust that we formed 20 years ago to advocate for Takatapui. So I'm Takatāpui. I use she, her, and ia pronouns. Ia is a Māori word because which is a pronoun in our language, which is non-gendered. And so much of our language is not gendered, despite a lot part of our culture being extremely gendered. So Te Whanawhana, we advocate for Takatapui, so that's Māori who are with diverse genders, sexualities, and sex characteristics. And I'd like to shout out to my co-leader, Kevin Honui, who is on this call and helped arrange for me to be here today. So ngā mihi atu ki a koe. What else about me? Let's see, yes, an artist. One of my claim to fame is I produced an artwork called Mana Takatapui. So that was about the right of our people to health, well-being and dignity, but also spoke about our leadership. And that piece was bought by Parliament to commemorate the passing of marriage equality in our country. It hangs in the Rainbow Room here in Parliament. Then last October, I was elected to Parliament. I am a member of the Green Party, and my absolute role here is to advocate for our people. And because I am a cisgender lesbian femme who is Takatapui, I'm absolutely about creating space for our trans, non-binary and intersex whānau family to make sure their voices are heard, and that we actually change some laws to make sure that protecting our people, looking after our people, supporting that health and well-being, we make the changes that are needed at this level in the world. After being an activist for about 40 years, this is an exciting place to be. Just last night, I spoke in the House, checking the time, about cervical cancer, and I spoke about people with who have a cervix and a vagina, and that although there's many of us are cis women, actually some of us are also trans men and intersex and non-binary people. So I'm very excited to be able to put that narrative always, every single time I speak, into our Parliament and eventually into our government. So my other claim to fame is we did a petition against conversion therapy, and we got nearly 160,000 signatures in a week. And so we forced the government to put banning conversion therapy on the agenda, and that we should be leading into that work soon. So lovely to be here. I look forward to our discussions here today. Kia ora.
Great. Thank you so much, Ngā mihi. Thank you so much for all the incredible work that you're doing back in Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's brilliant. So thank you. You've helped a lot of my friends and everything back home. I'm a New Zealander as well. Great. So next we are going to move on to the wonderful Dan. If they don't mind turning their camera on, and I'll turn mine off again. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Dan Taulapapa Mcmullin. I'm in my studio in Hudson, New York, in upstate New York. I'm from American Samoa. Samoa is a nation in the South Pacific. it's currently divided into two countries, the independent state of Samoa and the US territory of American Samoa. I'd like to read a poem from my book of poems, Coconut Milk, and it's a little bit about my childhood in Samoa. And it's about making tapa cloth, which is made from bark, and which is traditional form of art making and of painting in Samoa. I first knew the art of painting by the smell of o'a, juice of the blood tree, bright orange, in white lacquer tin bowls nailed to the bark, filled with color and the scent of o'a. Down the path through the rainforest to great grandma and grandma's fale, fa'asapa in Sisipeni. One doesn't forget the smell of o'a or coconut oil on old ladies' arms, walking on their legs to massage them. Fa'asapa as thin and dark and hard as a foul hibiscus tree, delicate in her gentleness, 100 years old. She took her upeti board and brushed on songa to keep the bark cloth from sticking. Now, working in oil paints, the smell of the oils is pungent to remind me of fresh o'a and songa. Sisipeni, my grandma, stout and white-haired, ironed with a flat iron on a small, cold brazier, sewed embroidery on pillow slips, alunga patterns, Bibles and hibiscus flowers, proverbs in Samoan in Gothic letters. There is a day that never ends, a small child and two old women. And that's about my very dearly beloved grandmother and great-grandmother, who I'm about as old as, as they were when I was a small child, and that's how I was able to walk on my great-grandmother's legs, because I was quite small. I don't know what else to say other than I'm Fafine, which means the way of a woman. I remember the first time I did a poetry reading tour, people seemed surprised that I presented in not necessarily a transgender manner. But in Samoa, the queer community is centered the queer community is centered around transgenderism. And so one is Fafafine because the community sees one as Fafafine. And that is sort of the social category. I'll read just really, and then I'll stop, but a brief poem. The whole issue, and I'm sure we'll go into this discussion as we're talking about museums and decolonization. But the Bible is huge in Samoa, of course, with the coming of the London Missionary Society throughout the South Pacific. And I wrote a brief poem about the English Bible. It is written, "Thou shalt not lie down with mankind as with womankind. It is an abomination." In the Samoan Tusipa'ea, it is written, "Aulua te mamoe mase tane e pe ona mamoe mase fafine. Ole mea e inosia lavalea." Thus it is written that a tane, which is man, cannot sleep with a tane. But it is not written that a tane cannot sleep with a fafafine. And that's my viewpoint on it. But I think because when the Bible was translated, I think it was Reverend George Pratt of London Missionary Society, he actually worked with a group of Samoan chiefs. And when they came to that verse, it is my supposition that they didn't want to offend the Fa'afafine community in Samoa. And so they couldn't say it is forbidden for men to sleep with Fa'afafine. So what they said is, well, men want to sleep with men, but they didn't say Fa'afafine. In fact, they don't mention Fa'afafine throughout the Samoan translation of the Bible, and I think that was intentional. And I'm going to mute myself now.
Brilliant. Oh, thank you so much. And thank you so much for sharing those, your beautiful and evocative writing. I'm actually going to pop a link in the chat of one of my other favorite pieces of writing by Dan, which is called Over My Queer Samoan Body, if that's okay. And I've also popped Dan's website in there, and also a link to some resources put together by Elizabeth on Takatapui. All right, brilliant, wonderful. We will now move on to Hina, and then we'll get, after that, we'll get into the discussion. Brilliant, thank you.
Aoia, ano ai te alohi a katoa pauloa e te anaina katoa e launa nei. Te aloha nui a otoa pauloa, mai pai aina aloha o Hawai'i nei, o au no teia o Hinaleimoana Wong-Kalu. Te haawi nei no au I tu aloha nui ia otoa pauloa me tu leo ho'omeitai malo anui katou launa ana ma te ia wahi hala wai nei ma Zoom. Te aloha nui no ia katou a pau. Aloha. It is a privilege to share time and space here for today's webinar and coming to you from my islands of Hawaii, my mainland, my homeland. And I start off by saying that because the work that that I do is focused primarily on working towards ensuring that there is proper dignity and respect to my people in our own homeland. And we see different kinds of examples throughout Polynesia and the rest of the Pacific where colonization has had such a reeling and rippling effect upon people. And here in Hawaii, we are probably the prime example of this. And so any of the work that I am privileged to do in my community for my people is with the understanding that I don't necessarily have to hold the LGBT or the trans flag. I simply have to hold the flag of my people. And over many years, I have demonstrated that by doing so, it earns the respect and the love and consideration of my people to lift me and others like myself up. In a most recent 2019 effort, we brought to the attention of our community before the impact of the COVID. We had assembled our people and marched 20,000 strong. However, we saw that the world did not really receive the news of 20,000 Hawaiians marching to bring awareness and to bring solidarity and to bring strength to our Pacific peoples and our causes. Why? Because colonial news and political and economic forces here in Hawaii, in my homeland, would ensure that we were so nominalized that it was just as if we were out for a walk in the park. But as the māhū, or most appropriately put, thanks to our Native American brothers and sisters, their reference to people like myself, we are acknowledged as two-spirit or multi-spirit individuals, which, as Dr. Elizabeth Kerekere had pointed out earlier, that ia or oia or goia is our pronoun for both, for all, for he, she, and it. And you know, there were many of us Takatapui, many of us māhū, who led that march of 20,000 people. And we are some of the ones who lead our political struggles here in Hawaii. Māhū people are keepers of culture and history and language in my homeland. And by and large, we are, for those of our fellow Hawaiians who tend to cling to our culture, we are held in close regard and in respect. So anyway, my work is currently focused on being in the Hawaiian community for empowerment for my people. Some of the work includes teaching some of our Hawaiian men in incarceration at 2 different facilities when it's either open to me or when we can establish a Zoom now with the different restrictions that COVID-19 has brought to Hawaii. It also includes doing workshops and doing other different things to provide cultural resource support and simply to be an example and to be someone who can be relied on to sway the minds and the hearts of our community on the issues that are most pressing and most important to us. So without any further ado, I will turn this time back over to our hostess so that we can continue on with the questions. But mahalo anui to all of you for today's opportunity. Mahalo.
Hello, and thank you so much again. The kind of scope of your work is absolutely incredible. And yeah, I'm just so impressed by you all, essentially. I would love to kind of get the conversation. You can all pop your cameras back on now, by the way, if you'd like to. So I'd like to kind of start off the conversation sort of talking a little bit about kind of the labels, identity labels, which you've all sort of spoken a little bit about. Now, Hina, I saw in an interview with yourself where you kind of spoke about kind of being sort of bullied at school and that your refuge was your kind of Hawaiian culture identity. And also, I saw another interview, sorry, I'm a bit of a fan, with you explaining that, you know, originally the term māhū felt kind of, you know, maybe offensive to you with if other people were kind of, you know, calling you that. And so, and eventually that, you know, became a term that you sort of came to accept. But then you also say you don't necessarily fly the kind of LGBTQ flag, you fly the flag of your culture. Now, and Elizabeth, I saw in an interview with you, you're telling a story, I think it was about coming out to your great grandmother, or was it, yeah, grandmother born in 1903. And she spoke about kind of the aunties that were just part of the whānau or the part of the family, and they didn't necessarily have a label on themselves. So that those 2 kind of points got me thinking, but I'd love to hear from all 3 of you about how important labels are to you, and, you know, whether that be your kind of, you know, cultural labels, or whether that be LGBTQ. Do you feel an affinity with kind of, you know, labeling yourself in kind of a Western LGBTQ way? Yeah, I'd love to just hear your thoughts on where you kind of stand on labels and how you feel about that. So if there's anyone that would like to volunteer to respond first, that would be lovely. Otherwise I can pick on one of you. Maybe we could start with Hina, perhaps. If that's all right, I'd love to hear more about, you know, your thoughts. I'm really interested in what you said about, you know, not necessarily flying the LGBTQ flag. So I'd love to hear more about that, where, you know, where you stand on kind of this identifying
Yes.
labels.
Yes, thank you, mahalo. Do I support initiatives that support our LGBT people? Absolutely. But my political perspectives, given that number 1, Hawaii is my pito, It is my umbilical cord. It is my home. And therefore, everything radiates in and out. It gets synthesized through the lens of Hawaii as my home. And therefore, by the application of the term māhū, of which I should note that I grew up thinking that it was bad. I grew up thinking that to be someone who is either physically born a male, but to a certain degree, more or less in the way of female, and vice versa. Born a female and is more or less masculine, male. I grew up observing the examples that told me it was negative. But therein lies a dilemma, because Hawaii and my culture, my language, were not the focal lens by which I was able to synthesize my life's experiences. And so now at age 49, as of May, I am ever more in the resolve that I don't need to deliberately advocate for LGBT or trans anything. I need to advocate for my culture and my people, because it is the framework of that culture, our history, and our language here in our own homeland, that if we uphold these values, then there's a greater sense of equity, fairness, and a greater sense of empowerment for all. Just because I'm māhū doesn't necessarily mean that I'm any more than or less than my fellow Kanaka. It does not necessarily mean, well, oftentimes it does, because it comes with great responsibility, but from perhaps a more humble perspective, I'm not any better than the next person. And so, we acknowledge in Hawaii that right next to Kane, right next to Wahine, stand māhū. We don't have to stand in the front. We don't have to stand in the back. We stand shoulder to shoulder. So, yes, I was asked in 2004, when the first discussions about same-sex marriage came to Hawaii, they asked, did I support it? And I said, no. For what? My culture, I don't need a piece of paper, or I don't need a proclamation by a church or any kind of other institution to say that I care and love for someone and that my family will welcome them into my home and my life. That's not something that I subscribe to. However, it should be said that, the Western world that imposes itself on us every day, you never seem to get away from it. So if I was wearing the hat of being someone who exists in this time and space, then of course it's a no-brainer. But again, realizing that I've always maintained political independence views for my people outside of the clutches of the United States of America. Their oppression, their oppressive ways are disguised as, how do I say it? They're disguised as being good Americans. And it's just quite a lengthy discussion, but anyway, that's my answer for you. And I hope that it serves the question.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Definitely.
I wonder if either Elizabeth or Dan had something to kind of add to that at all. No pressure, obviously.
Kia ora. I'm really happy to follow on from that. When I was first a young activist, it was very much about fighting for our people, trying to get back our language, fighting to get back our land, all of those things that have been taken from us quite mindfully through colonization from the British. And for quite a while, it was never about being, at that time, lesbian. That was the only word I had access to. but through the teachings and the writings of Ngā Hui Te Awa Kōtuku, a Takatapui scholar, and found the word Takatapui in the writings of the first Māori to write manuscripts in English. I mean, in Māori, they were subsequently translated. But when we were an oral traditions culture, and so the English taught us to write, of course, through the Bible. But the in those writings, we found the whakapapa, the genealogy of who we were, and that's when we realized that actually was a normal part of our cultural life pre-colonization. And so when we found their word, that's what I held on to, because it's not just a Māori word for a Western or white construct, which people will say lesbian, gay, all of those things are, but often that's just another way to discriminate against us. But actually it's something that says this is an old, actually ancient term that was used by our people. And rather than it being an identity, it was actually an endearment. And I love that idea that it was a normal part of life back then. And it was about our spirituality. It was about who we're attracted to. It's just about who we were as people. However, the priority was still being part of the family. And so for me, Māori first, always. But being Takatapui is a Māori identity. It's a normal part of our people. And so when we set up Te Whanawhana, our advocacy group, we made it open to everybody. And we saw that politically, because we set it up here in Wellington, in the capital, is that we, in order to uplift our Takatapui whānau, our family, that we had to uplift our Māori side, but also our rainbow communities, because many of us are based within them, especially our young people who are looking for support. But actually there's heaps and heaps of us just out in the community, getting on with our lives, because we're able to and at this stage. And so in claiming Takatapui, it's a way of saying, claiming, reaching back to our ancestors and honoring the ancestors that we had. It's a way of saying that my culture, my spirituality is as important to me as my sexuality, my gender, my sex characteristics, that all of those things are woven together. And in a world that wants to put us in boxes so that they can control us and, I don't know, somehow make themselves feel better, that we resist that. We say, actually, all of these things weave together, and we will create as many safe spaces as we can in order to protect and look after our people and just kind of let people get on with life. Some of us don't want to march down the street. Some of us will be happy to sign a petition online, but being political is not necessarily part of who we are, and we should. However, we want to live our lives, be able to get on with that without discrimination, without violence, without the hassle that often comes with being part of our communities. The last thing I would add is this here, my moko kauwai. This is a tāmoko. This was done 5 years ago after we did the headstone for my father's unveiling. And it is tattooed. People often ask, this is not lipstick. This is a lot of pain. But it means waiwai pākura, which means the footsteps of a pūkeko, which is a bird here, which it claims space, and you often see them in industrial areas, and regardless of what's happening around them, they survive, and they don't care what's happening, and they hold space. And so for me, this represents holding space. So we're creating safe space for our people, especially our young people, and right up to holding space here in Parliament. So kia ora.
Thank you so much, and thank you for sharing that meaning with us. It's so beautiful and perfect. So I'd love to kind of expand on what we were talking about a little and pick on Dan slightly, because I absolutely love the kind of use of sort of photographic and historical photographic and archival evidence sort of mixed in with, you know, personal stuff. And I was quite interested in sort of what your thoughts are on sort of, you know, putting labels on people in the past and how you sort of, and how you kind of went about finding this material that you sort of have incorporated into your work. I'd love if you would be able to share on that. Thank you.
I think as queer people in Polynesia, remembering that queer is an English word, as is Polynesia, and they don't. Anyway, I've always looked at history and the archive as something of interest, but I began taking a particular interest in my own practice as an artist and as a writer about 10 years ago when I began, 8 years ago when I began looking at tiki kitsch and the idea of appropriation, and how Hollywood appropriated, and a number of my relatives were involved in these sorts of films, appropriated Polynesian culture, and for a film I made called 100 Tikis, which is about tiki appropriation, and it's a story I sort of create from archival Hollywood film footage. But I began looking at the history of appropriation and the history of oppression of queer people in the Pacific, and the connections to Samoa, where I'm from, but also to Aotearoa and Hawaii and other parts of the Pacific, because we were all connected through the London Missionary Society in the and through Cook's voyages, Captain Cook's voyages in the Pacific, because it was Captain Cook who first identified the queerness of Polynesia. He began writing about the Aikane, and of course Hina would know more about this than I, but the Aikane were young men who were sort of working up to be chiefs, and they would be lovers of chiefly men and chiefly women of kings and queens of Hawaii. And it was a very open practice, and the English were shocked by this, and they wrote about this, and they wrote home about this, and they wrote bestsellers about the shocking practices of Polynesians and other Pacific Islanders. And it became a sort of industry to write about our cultures in this manner. And also on the Cook voyage was William Bligh, the same Captain Bligh of the mutiny of the Bounty and all that. And he was the first one to write about the māhū. And he was introduced to, for some reason, Cook was sort of blind to men living as women. But we have to remember that our peoples at that time didn't have the same markers of what was a woman and what was a man in terms of dress as the Westerners did. When the London Missionary Society came to the islands, one of the first rules they had was, because women's hairstyles tended to be short and men's hairstyles tended to be long, they made a law that women had to grow their hair long, and that men, at least they did in Samoa, and that men had to cut their hair short. And so this was sort of a marker of what, it was a reversal for Polynesians of many, many things. And so Bligh was so fascinated by one of the people who was pointed out to him as māhū, that he took upon himself to physically examine this person to see if they actually had male parts. So this was in his journals, but to me, if we look at the beginning of this long oppression of queer people in the West, when did that begin to open up? I would suggest that perhaps it began to open up when the Europeans encountered the Polynesians, and they saw a society where queer people were accepted in a very open way. and where transgenderism was accepted in a completely open way and was celebrated in the songs. Now the first thing they wanted to do was to suppress these accounts, the queer accounts. And if you look at Gray, who was the collector of the Motetea, I believe is the pronunciation, Elizabeth. Gray was, in the 1800s, was the, he controlled New Zealand. He was the Governor General, I think. But he also was fascinated by the Maori, and he collected their stories in a collection of Motetea. But he says in the introduction, he says that there were some stories that he could not record. And he suggests, and to me, this suggests that those stories were the stories of sexuality, but specifically queer sexuality. So those stories he did not collect. So when Ngahuia Te Awakotoku, the famous Maori lesbian activist in New Zealand and LGBT activist in New Zealand, first began writing about Takatapui, there was so, she had to rely on a lot of these stories that Gray collected. Now, if we look at Fornander, who was the collector of the mo'olelo, or the stories in Hawaii, there are many Aikane stories. He didn't really collect too many māhū stories that mention māhū, but he collected a lot of Aikane stories. And those stories, I think, became visible because the word Aikane was changed in the colonial translations to mean friendship rather than lover. Whereas before it meant the whole spectrum from friendship to protege to lover. But in the change of what was a permissible definition of Aikane, it was changed to mean a friend. So those stories and there are many, many stories of Aikane in the collections of Fornander, which are volumes of books. They were seen to mean friends, but they actually meant lovers. And if you read them in Hawaiian, they are very passionate accounts of lovers who are lovers of men and women, and in a very open way. So I think a lot gets lost in translation. A lot was purposely lost. When Pratt wrote his first dictionary of the Samoan language, Reverend Pratt, who translated the Samoan Bible, he says in the dictionary that there are words he would not use because they're too obscene. But he tells us this in the second edition of the Samoan dictionary. He didn't include them in the first edition, but in the second edition, he says, I've decided to include these words. And I think that's because the meanings of those words would pop up in the Bible. And he needed, and he quoted something from Shakespeare about how one included certain kinds of words to know what to hate. And that's why he included these words, because he wanted people to know what they should hate. And so that's how words like fafafine and tautane and the other gender and words of sexuality in the Samoan language came into the Samoan dictionary. So there's an entwined history between England and Polynesia, and between Europe and Polynesia. That the French are also very involved. The Germans were also very involved in Samoa in this history, but it was originally the English who kind of. But I think my thought is that this struggle among the English against these queer histories of Polynesia was the beginning of the opening of English society to a conversation about queer cultures, to me. And so I think that's very interesting.
Yes, absolutely. That is, yeah, I was really interested in first what you were saying about putting a label on something so you know what to hate. That's, yeah, such a horrible and concept, but it, yeah, obviously makes sense. And so it's interesting that some of these, you know, words have been passed down through that, but also, yeah, that kind of reminded me of, again, what I think you were saying in Samoan Queer Lives about kind of these sort of identities then influencing, you know, kind of American gay liberation, and as well as kind of, you know, two-spirit identities. And I really liked what you said. It really helped me understand kind of thinking on gender, where you said, like much Samoan thinking, it is not binary and oppositional, but bilateral and reciprocal. And that, yeah, I thought was a brilliant way of kind of, yeah, understanding this. So I would love to then kind of, yeah, go a bit more into kind of the kind of galleries, museums and archives aspect of the evening, and ask you if, first of all, if there's any representations that you've been really impressed by, and secondly, what your kind of ideal representation of your identity might be. You know, would it be kind of, you know, a whole sort of separate exhibition, or would you rather it be kind of included within kind of an exhibition on your culture, or on a kind of LGBTQ exhibition, which we've already spoken a little bit about, the kind of, you know, Western pioneers. So yeah, I'd love to hear kind of what you'd love to see, essentially, in either galleries, museums, archives. Go for it. Or shall I pick on someone? Elizabeth is nodding, so might have been nodding at something else.
No, I was nodding at you pick someone, but I didn't. Yeah. Okay. So firstly, I think in all the Māori work that we do and all of the rainbow work we do, we say that we should have a say, we should be in a decision-making role in all issues that affect our lives in whatever way. So when we think about museums and galleries and that world, that and I lived and worked in that world for a long time. As a 26-year-old, I was fortunate to be on the project team that designed and built Te Papa, our new national museum. Well, not new now, I was very young. And so at that time, we were still fighting to make sure there was proper Māori representation. And over the years, I want to shout out, there's a group which is Rainbow Museums of Aotearoa. And that's to make sure that the people who's a support group network for people who are rainbow, who work within and using rainbow in its most inclusive form, to include people of all identities and our communities, is to support them within that organization, because although I'm not sure about other countries, but it's especially galleries are renowned for having lesbian and gay people, and then very slowly people of other identities being represented, but also to guide their respective institutions to be more representative in how they staff their institutions, the range of exhibitions or programs that they put in, and how they open that space for other people to take part. And the other big thing I wanted to acknowledge is LAGANZ, the originally Lesbian and Gay Archives of New Zealand. It's been around. I was trying to remember when it actually started. I think the 70s. And just want to again shout out to Kevin Honui, who's on here as the chair of LAGANZ. We've got Will Hanson as one of our young people who are on our board, and I'm on the board as well. But we hold a collection. I've been sent material, so manuscripts, posters, ephemera, serials, and book collections of people across the rainbow spectrum, including our Pacifika whānau. We're housed in the Alexander Turnbull Library, which is part of our National Library. And so another aspect then is about collecting our material, because when it gets to the point of having exhibitions, having shows in museums or galleries, where do we get that from? And then what are our contacts with community? How do we ensure that our artists our performers, our writers, everybody is represented in the way that, including whatever publications that might be put out. So it's all of the things we should be involved in. And so absolutely, we've done a lot of work in this country around trying to very mindfully, right up to current discussions with Te Papa, our National Museum, and the Art Gallery, to say how could we do something that's very specific to our community to be in some sort of long-term show there. So kia ora.
Brilliant, thank you. Hina, I'd quite like to ask you, so I know you've done some brilliant work in kind of exploring these topics in the medium of film. Again, I'm just going to link your brilliant short film about the kind of origin of the māhū identity. And I know you've been involved in a recent exhibition that I've been speaking to Joe Wilson about, possibly bringing to over to the Pitt Rivers. So yeah, I'd love to hear more about that latest kind of film project and exhibition, and sort of how you feel about kind of representation outside of that as well. What other people are doing? Are they doing any good? That's the question.
Thank you. I do apologize. I can't control the sounds outside of my house at the moment. It's just loud for a moment. Film. Can you help redirect my attention for a moment and like put the question to me in a different way?
Yeah, sorry, I kind of rambled that at you. So there's kind of 3 parts of the question, really. Sorry. And the first is, I would love to hear about kind of your thoughts on using film as a medium, as a kind of activist medium, I guess, kind of getting the message across through film. And secondly, I was speaking to Joe Wilson about an exhibition that you're involved in. So I'd love to hear more about that. We've been speaking about bringing that to the Pitt Rivers, which would be amazing. So I'd love to hear a bit more about that. Yeah, that's essentially the first 2 parts. And then the last part, I was wondering what you thought about other efforts to kind of represent the māhū identity, if there are any kind of good examples.
Yes. So when it comes to film, especially animated film, our recent project we have yet to complete in terms of the hour-long documentary portion of Kapai Māhū, but the 8-minute animation, we were very fortunate that it made it to the large screen, and it was nominated for an Oscar award. And so here's something for everybody to digest. When I set out to be a part of this film project and anything else that I avail my name and my face to, it is always rooted and grounded in what's important to Kanaka. It is of no significance necessarily to me to try to go for a world, recognition level thing. Although by default, by simply even being nominated for it, it just brings so much attention and awareness. So I understand that. However, it's not my goal in terms of being the gauge for success. And so for me to bring the story of Kapai Māhū to not only the large world screen, it was to honor and uplift my people and our stories, our history. Animation gave me a wonderful way to, in a few seconds, to illustrate what the word Māhū means. And it allowed us to, like magic, say there's a combination of male and female. We do not have to subscribe to Western imposed ideals terms of what exactly is or is not a part of māhū. We are diverse people. In 2021, when we look at ourselves, we have to be able to see the spirit, the place and the set of the spirit in the individual. We have to see our emotions. We have to see our mind. The physical is but a temporary manifestation for our time on this earth. And, you know, for many trans people, especially, we deal with all kinds of issues, you know, body confidence or lack thereof, because we don't necessarily have the body that we want, that we feel fits who we are and represents us who we are. But for myself and a few others in my circle, we're not necessarily about that. We're about the emotional, spiritual, and the mental place that we exist in. The exhibit that you were engaging my colleague Joe Wilson on is the Bishop Museum exhibit. There's a whole building called Castle Hall, and it will house the Kapai Māhū film and all of the related things that we're going to bring forth. And it will serve to highlight and uplift the story of the 4 legendary healers that come from the homelands of Kahiki. And, you know, by doing so, we honor the journey that our ancestors made. We honor their place in our lives. Without them, we would not exist. We honor them for the wealth of knowledge that they leave to us and entrust in us to perpetuate. And that includes these understandings of places of prominence and respect when it comes to māhū. Can you imagine that 4 great stones were erected to honor these individuals? The reason why it was pronounced that they were māhū, or that they possessed elements of duality about them, is because they were all the more stronger healers because of it. They weren't being celebrated because they were simply māhū. They were celebrated because these people had duality and they commanded the mana of Kane and Wahine in one body. And therefore it made them all the more a formidable source of mana and strength and knowledge. So that speaks to the project that we are calling Kapai Māhū, and it acknowledges that one element of history. And I hope that it would inspire others to consider what story do they want to tell from within our history. You know, quite frankly, I'm tired of talking about Māhū this and that and this and that, because there's so many other different things to talk about. You know, Māhū is just like, oh, okay, you guys aren't fit, you know. I don't need to talk about it. Every day I look in the mirror, I see my face, you know. I don't need to be reminded of it. And it's already a challenging journey. You know, for anybody who saw the film Kumuhina, my now ex-husband, you know, we're friends.
It's 10 o'clock.
But when we were married, he took his fair share of cracks from the community, especially his community, you know, because he was married to a Māhū. So I don't need an extra reminder of, you know, this life that we live. It's just merely it's just one facet. That's what I'm trying to say. You know, and the fact that somebody can be Takatapui or Māhū or Fa'afafine, Fa'atsama, Fakatangata, Fakaleti. It's an adjective, it's a description. It tells an element about us, but it does not define us. It doesn't have to be. And it should not be the end all. You know what I'm saying? So there's so much to all of us that the more we keep focusing on it, the more we don't even get to some of the more interesting intimacies of our thoughts and our feelings and our perspectives.
Yeah, thank you so much for that reminder, because it's definitely something that we Westerners need to think about in terms of representation. It's like, oh, we'll just represent this identity, but that's not a holistic approach. That's just one tiny thing. So thank you very much for that reminder, and I hope that all of us attending this event will really think about that.
I don't mean anybody any offense.
Oh no, not at all. It's a really I'm really glad you brought that up, because yeah, it's obviously an important thing to say, especially when I've created this event around it. So yeah, that's really something to think about, and not reducing people just to their identity. So we do have a few questions coming in already, but I'd like to just go slightly over and ask one more question to the three of you, which is, do you think, it's quite a big question, so feel free just to kind of speak about an aspect of it, but do you think that decolonization in museums is possible, particularly in kind of Western museums? Do you think that is something that could be achievable, obviously with the help of the communities that the material is related to? But yeah, do you think it could be possible in a future, a utopic future, I guess? Dan, maybe we could start with you.
Well, I mean, it was last summer that all the statues were being pulled down, the Confederate statues in the US, and I think a few statues all over the world. But that was part of a long conversation that a lot of these institutions, which not to reduce them, but were created to institutionalize white supremacy. A lot of these, and colonialism, they were collection houses for all the material that the missionaries didn't burn and had sent back to Europe for, and the rest, of course, they burned, or they converted our peoples to burn them themselves. And in that fire also went queer identity, whatever we call it. So one might say that I really don't know how to answer that question. I mean, it's sort of like these long discussions that we all have. Like what's going on in Israel. It's really when the Jewish community itself began protesting what was going on in Israel, that the overall media says, okay, it's okay to talk about Palestine as though it exists. It's okay to talk about the Palestinians as though they exist. So I think it's the same thing with museums. It's when the museums themselves, and dare I say, white people in control of these museums, when they themselves know that in order to grow as museums and as institutions, they need to hire Pacific Islander curators. They need to show contemporary Pacific Islander artists, because we still exist, and writers, and to create space for conversation. It's, of course, they just took down, there's a museum in New York City that has the annual Indigenous Film Festival, and they commissioned me to create an installation for this film festival. And I was creating it, but right outside the museum was a statue of Teddy Roosevelt with an African-American slave kneeling on one side of his horse and an indigenous Native American kneeling on the other side. And there were all these protesters protesting this statue and coming into the museum. So you're always sort of in these odd positions, and you're also always engaged in a conversation that is always being commodified. So you just do what you do, and you say your piece, and you struggle to work with communities that one is a part of, that one lives in, and but it's a two-way conversation, or at least two-way in many ways. And there's no single representation for either side. And there's no single viewpoint, there are many viewpoints. So I guess that's the best way I could answer that question.
Yeah, brilliant, thank you. And that, yeah, kind of reminds me what you're saying with that statue being outside, is, you know, you do get...
that statue did come down.
Oh, yeah.
Eventually.
Good. Good. Yeah.
2 months ago, actually.
Oh gosh, that was awful. Yeah, it just made me think, even, you know, even at the Pitt Rivers, for example, you know, there's kind of work by, you know, contemporary artists that, you know, quite activist-y type work, and kind of, you know, coming from Indigenous artists and things like that. But it is interesting that it's, yeah, sometimes in a space kind of right next to something that might feel quite violent, and yeah, well, oppressive and offensive. So yeah, that's why I was kind of thinking about this. Is this sort of decolonization possible? Because, you know, a lot of projects and things tend to just have, you know, enough money for one kind of small project within something else. So yeah, we need to really kind of get institutions to put their money where their mouth is, and actually, you know, hire curators and things from these identities, because it's, you know, so important. So
I mean, eventually it's people do their own thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like Hina with her films and her teaching, Elizabeth with her artwork and her teaching, myself with my writing and my artwork. I mean, you just do your own thing eventually. And then you have various conversations with you know, we always, often in Samoa, we have different terms for, if you're not getting along with this side of the family, you run to that side of the family. And it's the same thing with these institutions.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you sort of engage in a conversation, and hopefully you part as friends, and then you engage in conversation over there. And but basically the war is actually sort of internal to a certain degree. It's within your own space, and then you can kind of take it out into the greater community, because these oppressions weigh in on a person, and it's you know, someone like Hina and Elizabeth, and you know, I think our first battles was ourselves. I know it was for me, and I'm still, you know, and then you kind of throw it on a page or on a canvas or on a screen, and there it is. But it's a moment, and then you move on to the next work, and it's about the conversation that creates a community.
Yeah, brilliant. And yeah, we really appreciate your labor here this evening and kind of explaining things to us. So I've got a question here. Well, it is directed to Elizabeth, but it could probably also apply to everyone, but it's specifically about Takatapui, which is what would you suggest UK and European-based museums do as first steps to contact Takatapui to co-work with, is the question we have here.
Kia ora. I'm really excited to help with that. First of all, I just wanted to acknowledge that it's really important when people are talking about any kind of decolonizing and is about recognizing privilege, that saying actually, yes, our whole institution generally has been built on the backs of Indigenous and Black and Brown people around the world. And I think it's, if you're going to take it seriously, then it's more than just having an exhibition or having a performance of some brown people in your institution. So it's about creating relationships, definitely what Dan said, finding out who's who in your area, perhaps having a clear analysis of the material in your institution. Where does it come from? So in this example, I'm not sure if people have collections from Aotearoa, but if you're wanting to tell that kind of story, then I would say, absolutely recognizing the labor that comes. We are constantly consulted with, asked advice. I now have a paying job working here, but for 20 years I was self-employed so that I could do my activism work. So just recognizing that all the power comes with the institution. And so if you're going to bring somebody in to give advice or help you curate something, please allocate budget for that. I'm not saying you need to pay me for advice. I'm just saying that it's really important to recognize the imbalance of power that comes with these things, that in the end, the institution will make all the final decisions. So creating relationships. I would also say, if you're reaching out to another part of the world to talk to their Indigenous people, is do that with a mind of connecting with the Indigenous people in your own area. So one of the, a random thing, I was asked one time to take part in a kind of an exhibition, but a project which would acknowledge that a certain art building was built on around the graves of people who'd been slaves in the States. It's a very odd request, and my thing was immediately, it is seriously not appropriate for me. I can give you advice about contacting local people, which I kind of shouldn't have to, but connect with your local people. And then if it's useful to connect with other people around the world or with expertise. This is something this is kind of the area decolonizing government has been something I've worked on for a long time, because it's the key power in this country. However, totally support what Dan said, is in the meantime, while we're sorting all of that, you got to get on with your own stuff, because your whole life cannot be always fighting and trying to change. And sometimes we've just got our own things we've got to do, look after our family, bring up our kids, and get on with our other work. You know, relax sometimes, build sleep into our lives. But if people are serious about doing some work around this, I'm absolutely keen to have that conversation with them.
Brilliant, thank you so much. And yeah, that's something we definitely have kind of sort of started working with in the kind of first stages of the Beyond the Binary project, is kind of, you know, actually sort of paying community curators to kind of deal with material related to their identity. But of course, we, you know, can still improve on that more, and there's still this kind of institutional power situation going on there. So yeah, it's just something that I think, you know, we need to be able to admit when we get things wrong, and, you know, work on improving it. That's all I can say from kind of experience of working on, you know, just a, sort of an exhibition. So I have a question about of someone that's asking if you know about kind of much on representation in theatre at all. Have any of you got any sort of comments to say on that, or is that not necessarily your kind of area?
If I could mention the book that I co-edited with Yuki Kihara, Samoan Queer Lives, which is, yes, that's a that photograph is Siobhan when she won Miss American Samoa in, I think, the 70s or 80s, and she tells her story in that book. But there are also two really great plays in there. One by a Samoan playwright who used to live in London, Brian Fuata, and some of your, well, you have listeners from all over the world, but Brian wrote a play called Fafine, which is a one-person performance piece, and that's in the book. And another play by Kiana Rivera, who's a lesbian Samoan playwright. And it's a wonderful play called Pusi. And it's a brilliant play, really brilliant play.
Yeah, really.
So I would suggest those two plays in the book, and if I could.
Definitely, they're brilliant. And for anyone that is a Bodleian Library user, there are 2 copies, one in the Social Anthropology Library and one in the Pitt Rivers Library. So do check it out if you can't buy it. So I've got another question, which is probably a much better phrasing to the question I was kind of trying to ask before about decolonization. So the question here is it worth it to decolonize museums, or should more energy go into creating entirely new heritage/art spaces that aren't built on Western colonial ideas? Ideals rather. Yeah, just wondered if anyone would like to comment on that. I don't know if Hina is able to comment. We haven't heard from you in a short while.
Say that question again.
So is it worth it to decolonize museums, or should more energy/money go into creating entirely new kind of heritage and art spaces that aren't kind of Western or built on Western colonial ideals?
No, I think that we don't necessarily need to try to create something new. You know, we just have to repurpose ourselves, our minds. Part of the reason why, when I said at the beginning of this sharing about my sentiments towards needing to carry the LGBT or the trans flag, is because I don't feel the need to put a penis or a vagina on my forehead. I don't need to tell the world what I have or have not between my legs, and what I want or don't want between my legs or wherever. You know, it's recognition that should rightfully come to a gender binary, male, female, or someone who possesses duality, and however that duality is articulated by the individual is completely up to us. But speaking from the best perspective of Hawaiian and Pacific Island understanding that I can bring, is that we, number one, we identify by our land and our people. I come from the island of Oahu in the large district of Kona, otherwise known to the world as Honolulu. I come from a place that is called Liliha. Liliha at the border between Pu'unui. And the name of the major running stream in my valley is the Nu'uanu stream. And the ocean that fronts Honolulu is called Ma'amala. My family is the Kealoha family. It is Paleokawealoa. I come from the Kawahinekoa clan of people from Honokohau on the island of Maui. This is how we identify. And the assessment tools by which we should analyze our contributions to society should be based on how much we've given of ourselves. Doesn't really matter what we've contributed to, but the fact that we've given. To be Pacific Islander means we give more than we receive. It means that we avail ourselves to the benefit of others. Sometimes it's borderline. Well, let me step back for a minute. Living in an American-dominated place and seeing what the last American presidential climate was like. You know, one of the criticisms of President Barack Obama by President Trump was that his initiatives were socialist. But you see, he comes from Hawaii. He comes from that upbringing where we place great importance on giving for the benefit of others and looking after others. What did the world expect? You know, and okay, so if the United States of America is a capitalist world, then so be it. But we as Pacific Island people should not have to sacrifice the dignity and integrity of who we are because we're trying to fit. So again, when it comes to museums, what should museums do? Museums should simply work on the thinking capacity behind whatever initiatives will come forward. The spaces and places are just that. They are spaces and places, and they can be repurposed, rededicated, reused, recycled, redone, decorated. It's really the thinking of the people behind it and what's possible and what's not, if you ask me. And again, we don't need to place a penis or a vagina on our forehead and lead with that. You know, it's irrelevant. And for that matter, hey, if you got a penis or vagina coming your way, well, great, enjoy it. You know, our ancestors enjoyed such things, but we don't have to make it the every driving force behind our validity and the fact that we should be recognized. Anybody who succeeds, kane, wahine, or māhū, we should be acknowledged because we did something good.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I just wanted to see maybe if Elizabeth, particularly in terms of, you mentioned Te Papa before, what are your thoughts on this? Because that, you know, was kind of a new space that was created. So I wonder, yeah, what your thoughts were. I can remind you of the question, which is it worth to decolonize? Is it worth it to decolonize museums, or should more energy go into creating new spaces? So yeah, I'd love to hear a bit more from you on that, if that's all right.
Certainly, I think both. I think the institutions already exist, some of them for hundreds of years, and we certainly know that we have Māori collection items around the world, and we absolutely should have a say in some of the ways that they are displayed and interpreted. So these things exist, we have to deal with them. So, I mean, here we have Māori in senior positions, we have Māori throughout the institution, we have Takatapui in there, so we have our people holding space in there, having a say and holding them accountable really to their own commitment to what is our Treaty of Waitangi, the mechanism by which the British took over our country. In terms of new spaces, it's a lot of work to create a whole new institution, but I totally support if people have that vision and drive and resource to want to create, and there are a lot of community spaces throughout the country. So, and I love when people do pop-up things. It's just like, here it is, we're going to make a space and we're going to make this thing happen. But again, trying to duplicate the resource and the fundamental way that institutions operate is really, really difficult. I'm always, let's get in there and take over. That's why I'm in Parliament. That's the plan.
Yes, thank you. That just reminded me when you said pop-up. I think Sean's actually on the call here, well, at the event, but Sean Khan did a brilliant pop-up exhibition, which I believe was called Rainbow Pilgrims, about LGBTQ migrants around the world, and that came to the Pitt Rivers as well. So if you're interested in pop-up stuff, do check that out. Maybe Sean can put the link hopefully in the chat, because yeah, that was really interesting, and it's really easy pop-up, like kind of made of boxes that you install. So it's brilliant. Cool. I just wondered if Dan, whether you had anything to add to that question at all. You don't have to, obviously. Yeah. All right. Good. Cool. All right. So we are getting close to finishing time. So I'm just going to check the chat and the Q&A again, just in case. Oh, yep, here we go. Okay, one question. Okay, one more question, but it might have to be a slightly quicker answer than we would normally like, which is, how do you react to people from other cultural backgrounds using your gender expressions to construct, understand, or express their own gender expression? Do you consider it cultural appropriation? Elizabeth, did you have a comment or just nodding?
Just yes. It's when we reclaimed the word Takatapui in the 80s, and we've been promoting it as a way that connects us back to our culture and our spirituality. And we understand people feel really who are allies, who are not Māori and want to use those terms. And I always say to them, do not, just do not. Create your own terms. We've got a project coming soon whereby we will want to get all our language experts, Takatapui and the Māori Language Commission, Māori Dictionary, to sit down together and come up with really beautiful translations of words like lesbian, of words like non-binary, and intersex, so that they can have our Māori word that speaks to them and who they are, because that is something people are asking for and want, but don't use the words that our people use for ourselves, no.
Yeah, I think that's a good, pretty clear answer there. Oh, my New Zealand accent just came back in strangely. So I just wanted to quickly follow up on that, and then we'll get to Dan in just 1 second, was the terminology, all the new translations you're talking about. Do you think that will be something that then gets kind of integrated into archives and kind of museum databases as search terms? Is that kind of the plan, or haven't you kind of got there yet?
Hadn't thought that far, but genius.
Cool, brilliant. Yeah, because we've been thinking a lot about, you know, within this project, it wasn't just kind of an exhibition, but thinking about changing the museum kind of from within. And yeah, we've been thinking a lot about databases and labeling and sort of how to kind of approach that. And that's just another huge kind of thing to deal with, which the museum will, of course, deal with, you know, within kind of next stages of the project, because it's so important. Cool. Now, Dan, you had something to say?
I think on this question of appropriation, I think you get in questions of language drift, which is when you use a word from another language, but it just means a word that you might have used in English, and you actually lose the original meaning of the word. And I think a lot of times when people use words like māhū and Takatapui outside of the context of those communities, then they don't actually have the original meaning. And I think that's what happens when two languages sort of collide. And I guess the question is, can you enrich one language or the other with an understanding that these words like queer and Takatapui, for instance, they actually mean very different things. And when we use them interchangeably, we lose the meaning of both words.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a really, really important point for us to remember. All right, well, before we kind of close up, I just wanted to ask if anyone has anything else they're sort of desperate to say before we finish. Otherwise, I will then, I'm just going to show, we'll be maybe a couple of minutes over time, but I'm just going to show at the end the trailer for Ladies in Waiting, which we'll be showing next month, along with one of the film stars. I know that Hina was involved in the film. So yeah, any last words from anyone before closing up?
Just to say, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Namihi.
Same here. Thanks, Mara and Hina, Elizabeth. It's been a privilege to see everyone again and let's talk together.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Telonu ya otoa pauloa, mahalo, 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 no takato launa ana, Mahalo nui au tonu to ho. I ini e holo mua. And I believe since you mentioned the ladies in waiting, o kutonu pe ke o tomu toko ta whakawhita. Whawhita ke he e ki mama I orunga. Sene tuku mai whainga maria koe ni ke tau whetau laki mo ke tau lawe mo whe wahe aki. Ai ngahi elemeniti o si atau no fo o mo uini e whakaamuange pe te tau mao ngahi monu pe mao e whakalaka e he e tau mo uini. Ko iai whakamalo lahi at ka ki mo tolu kainga ko tō peo kumo si mea mai peke porokalamani o whalahi atu pe me he otu Hawai'i ni tu ai ki o whātu. Mahalo.
Mahalo.